Well, welcome, Natural Resources class. We're going to tackle today genetically modified organisms. Right up front, I'm going to say my assumption is that you have already watched the 4 segments of Harvest of Fear that are on Moodle. If not, maybe stop watching this video and go watch those 4 segments and then come back to this. We're also going to take a look at back to the Minnesota Millennial Farmer for your video exercise number 4. You will notice on Moodle a couple of other trailers that I'm going to have links to. One is Seeds of Death, and let's see, what was the other one? Food Inc. That I want you to look at to see how agriculture is portrayed. And farmers, you know, it's a thinly veiled attack on any farmer that isn't deemed organic or small family. And the Minnesota Millennial Farmer is not taking issue at this particular clip with genetically modified organisms treatment in the press and his growing of them. Rather, his issues with drain tiles. But I think the larger issue is still valid. Just how farmers get fed up with how they are portrayed in the press, and he just goes off and goes into depth in response to an article in the Minneapolis Star-Tribune. So look for that. So anyway, new video exercise number 4, 2 trailers to look for in Moodle, and so here we go. So genetically modified organisms, lots to do, lots to consider about that. There's a couple of articles I have here in front of me. One from 2008 where the Roman Catholic Church listed genetic modification, genetic experimentation, put it on its list of mortal sins. Oof. But then jump forward 6 years to 2014, and the Vatican changed its mind and now blesses GMOs, though unofficially. So we've got some sort of mixed signals from the Vatican. And as we look at this, always be looking for how this issue is treated in the media and the press. Very commonly, our same old system that we see where you mix distortion, flat out lies, some truth, some sort of truth, mix it all together. Just want to play the first part of this, one of these clips that I'm linking to. This is a Seeds of Death. It's just a trailer for the movie, and I'm going to have you notice something. So here we go.
Genetic engineering is a process where scientists take genes from one species and force it into the DNA of other species.
Every single independent study conducted on the impact of genetically...
Okay, I'm going to stop right there, and I'll let you watch the rest of the clip. Right off the bat, just like when we talked about how clear cuts are represented, and I showed you that video clip where they talked about the trees being torn down and clear cutting being maligned. Here again, we have genes being forced from one organism into another, and then they'll go on and pillory the whole process of GMOs. But I wanted to pause right here so that you could look at some of their citations. Now, they go over these kind of quickly, and you probably wouldn't notice them because there's a person talking, and if that person is wearing a lab coat and glasses and doing something with colored liquids in beakers, and even better yet, talks with an English accent, boy, you're more likely to believe that person. Watch for those things as you go through some of these clips. But I just thought I'd point out this citation. The AAEM is the citation for this particular quote. There's an organization called Quackwatch. You'll probably know where I'm going just by the name of it. Their job, their mission is to look up these organizations like AAEM here and just see if they're legitimate or not. They have 10 criteria that they look at. For example, they look at, does the organization oppose proven public health measures? How is it financed? Is it actually a real organization or not? And that sort of thing. And so I look at their list of organizations, and sure enough, there it is. AAEM, American Academy of Environmental Medicine, high on their list of quack organizations. But there's a citation here. The producer of this, I think, is Gary Null, and he's kind of an interesting guy. He's actually a college faculty member. You can look up the college. I forget the name of it right now. Farley something or another. He promotes pseudoscience. He has his own line of what is it? Health supplements. I'm not sure I'd take them. Anyway, yeah. That's who's produced this particular video that has gotten so much press. So there's a lot of hubbub over genetically modified organisms. But what in fact are they? And so if we look at some of the background here, I want to bring up a couple of individuals. Okay, as we talk about genetic engineering, I want to just consider a couple of key players. If you look at your notes, there are two that I'm going to highlight here. Now, of course, these aren't the only two players. These are just a couple of key guys. One is a gentleman by the name of Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. That's the person in the picture that you see here. And he was a French geneticist, if you will. You can see the time frame that he lived, 1744, 1829. About 1809, he came up with this idea that traits were acquired during one's lifetime and then could be passed on to offspring. And his famous example was of the blacksmith, whom through working that hammer day after day got a large arm from swinging that heavy hammer doing blacksmith work, and big muscular arm. And so Lamarck believed that because he got that big muscular arm, he could pass that on to his children, having big muscular arms, because he developed them during his lifetime. Gregor Mendel took it just a little bit different tack on it. He, of course, worked with peas. There has been some concern over the veracity of some of his work, but you cannot take away from the man that he came up with some really good ideas. He believed that you inherited dominant and recessive traits from your parents, and these two gentlemen really impacted the production of cereal grains, and lots of things, but those things in particular, down through history, even into our time. See, the idea that Mendel came up with, well, let's start with Lamarck. Lamarck thought, if you're going to grow wheat, it would be wise to go out in the field and pick the largest wheat heads with the biggest grains in them, biggest kernels in them, and then use those kernels for the seed for the next year's wheat plant, believing that they would then bear large wheat kernels again and increase the yield. And in fact, this did work in part for the wrong reason, or a slightly skewed reason from what Lamarck thought, but that's the way it went. And really, a lot of the former Soviet Union, their geneticists followed sort of a Lamarckian path. Lysenko was the person in particular. Mendel would argue that it's better to raise wheat by taking wheat from one region. Let's say it was able to grow from 75 to 88 degrees Fahrenheit. That's the temperatures in which it was actively growing. And if you cross that from a wheat from a colder region, which was, say, able to grow from 65 to 75 degrees, then you would get a hybrid. And that hybrid might be able to grow from 65 to 85 degrees and would be able to tolerate a greater variety of temperatures. Another example would be frost tolerance. Maybe across your wheat or whatever, a crop with a plant that was able to tolerate frost to some degree. And this is the area that really settled it. In the early 1970s, was it 1971, I think, Russia, following a Lamarckian philosophy in developing its wheat, lost almost its entire crop to a late spring frost. Their wheat would bear large fruits, but it did not have that hybrid vigor, that hybrid ability to tolerate a broader variety of temperatures. In that year, Russia losing its whole wheat, the U.S. agreed to sell the Soviet Union, which we were at odds with at that point, very remarkable odds. U.S. sold 44 million bushels of wheat. That was a quarter of the U.S. wheat crop. That was $700 million at the time. The Soviet Union bought it with credits from the World Bank, which of course the U.S. Backed. And it's kind of interesting that we ended up basically giving them the wheat and saving them from starvation. But what do you suppose? What effect do you suppose that had on U.S. wheat prices? you can bet they doubled and even tripled in that time period. My father-in-law mentions that he was a wheat farmer in Kansas, and that one year he paid off his entire farm debt because they had a really good wheat crop that year, and the price went through the roof because of that grain deal. Of course, U.S. taxpayers were behind that, but he definitely benefited from it. So those are the two gentlemen, Lamarck and Mendel, that are key players in different thoughts in how traits would be passed on. Of course, Mendel has been shown to be correct in his assumptions. Well, how is it done? Well, traditionally, this is of course looks like a lily. Could be any of these cereal crops have a flower of sorts on it, and there are female and male parts. So there's an ovary in this flower. There's an ovary in most all the plants, that we commonly consume. So this would be the female part. There's the stamen with the filament and anther and pollen producer here. The pollen, if it's a self-pollinating plant, will go from here down this tube and fertilize the egg in the ovary and create grain. This is the same in fruits or whatever. You would cross plants. Well, when it came time to flower, you would take these stamens from one plant containing the pollen, and maybe you would even cut these off of this one so the plant couldn't self-pollinate. But you would fertilize this plant with the filaments, with the pollen from another plant, and crossbreed it. That's how it was traditionally done. When you do that, as the video mentions, you cross thousands of genes, maybe tens of thousands of genes at a time, and you're not really thinking about which ones are going where. You're just hoping to come up with one successful cross that you can reproduce. That's how it was traditionally done. If you consider some of the plants that have been bred that way, this is corn. And usually with this system of crossbreeding, not only are you trying to breed desirable traits into the plant, but one of the main things you're trying to do is increase the ploidy of the plant. You might remember haploid and diploid from genetics. Well, you want tetraploidy. The more genes that the plant has for making the fruits, the grain or whatever, the more grain it will produce. This is corn's development. This is teosinte. This is what the wild variety of corn looks like. And about 9,000 years ago in Mexico, this began to be manipulated, and through time, we have developed this. This looks like a cob of sweet corn, corn from selective breeding. Wheat, I'm going to go to a different site for wheat. Wheat was developed in the Fertile Crescent about 10,000 years ago. Here's this crescent shape, this region right through Israel, southern Turkey, southern Russia, into Iran, Iraq, that area, Syria. So this is where wheat was developed. And if you look at how wheat was developed, there are some plants here. This is spelth, and this is goat grass, which is now a listed weed. If you cross those two, you can get emer and einkorn. You cross them again with goat grass, and you get modern wheat. To look at the specific grains, here's emer, here's einkorn. If you remember me talking about Otzi the Iceman, he was carrying, I think, either emer or einkorn in his pouch as a food item. It's it's a protein-packed grain, and HRS is hard red spring wheat. This is what we consume today for making bread, and well, this is one form of what we consume today. That's through traditional crossbreeding in that part of the world. Okay, if we go here, here's wild rice. Here's what its domesticated cousin looks like. You can see greatly increasing the size and quantity of kernels. If we go down, this is wild soybean, and here is domesticated soybean. And here's what each of these bean pods carries a soybean. Okay, soybean came from China about 5,000 years ago. Rice from China about 11,000 years ago. The potato, everybody associates the potato with Ireland. Actually, it came from Peru, developed in Peru about 10,000 years ago, brought back by the Spanish, adopted by the Irish, and we have the potato. Okay, so how is this idea of transgenic manipulation different from traditional breeding? Well, we've talked about traditional breeding, taking pollen on an anther from one plant and putting it in the ovary of another plant. Well, transgenic techniques, or horizontal gene transfer as they're called now, are a little different. In the case of GMOs, we're taking one or a very few genes, very targeted, very specific, and moving it from one species to another. The difference is we can take genes from different species and cross them. In traditional breeding, you could not move genes across species. You had to do that within species. You could breed different forms of corn, different forms of wheat, different forms of rice, whatever, to get your desired outcome, but you couldn't take corn and cross it with a cockroach and get something that was beneficial. With transgenic techniques, you can do that. As it says in the video, there's nothing about a gene that tells the body that that gene should or should not be in there. That's not the way it works. So this desirable gene, in the case of some of those talked about in the video, it might be the gene from a soil bacterium, Bacillus thuringiensis, that produces a protein that kills the European corn borer. So that gene in that soil bacteria, you don't take the whole genome from the soil bacteria, just the gene from that bacteria that produces the protein that kills off the European corn borer. Okay, you take that and you put it into the corn plant, and then you reproduce the corn. And how do you do that? Well, you isolate the gene, you duplicate the gene. That's pretty easily done in this day and age. You take that gene and you stick it on tiny tungsten balls. This is just the way the video was talking about it. You shoot those tiny tungsten balls into the target organism. Some of them will stay, some of them will bounce off, some of them will pass through, but some of them will get inside the cells, and and even fewer, some of the genes will actually be taken up by the plant, and some of those cells survive, and those plants then are transgenic and have that new gene in them and will hopefully express that protein. There's a lot missing here, folks. Just because you get a gene into an organism does not mean that that gene will be expressed. Does not mean that the protein that that gene is supposed to make will be made. See, that's all a gene is. A gene is simply the instructions for how a body should build a protein. Don't put too much on a gene. There's a whole other set of mechanisms that have to regulate what genes get turned on, when they get turned on, how the products are assembled after they are created. There's a lot more to it than just slapping one gene from one organism to another. This is so pilloried now, that so demonized, that we no longer call it genetic modification. Now the new term is horizontal gene transfer. And that's horizontal means moving from one species to another. Crossing that species boundary. That's what so many people are fearful of. And it's kind of interesting to me, because in actuality, every one of us is a transgenic organism. It is believed that 8% of the human genome is actually viral insertions. That means at some point in our past, one of our ancestors, many of our ancestors, contracted a virus. Many times viruses work by inserting their genome into the host, would be our ancestor, and then having that host's cells produce the viral gene that those genes, the viral protein that those genes code for. And if the ancestor survived, which obviously did, then that gene stays in their genome. And as I say, it is believed 8% of the human genome is viral insertions. You look at CRISPR-Cas9 technology now. We're using those technologies to insert genes and to get them turned on inside the human body to treat various ailments. And it's a wonderful technology. Of course, it has to be carefully used, developed, even regulated. I hate to say that word, but it's interesting that it is so pilloried. Even the millennial farmer now is growing a few acres of non-GMO plants. He doesn't agree with that. He knows that GM plants will produce more and would prefer to do that. But because he might be able to get a premium from people that are willing to pay more for non-GMO corn, he's going to try to grow some. So more power to him. But I worry about our society if we're so willing to put science aside and pursue these concerns. I would argue poorly founded concerns over GM products. I worry. As the one researcher from Cornell said in the video on Harvest of Fear, there's not been even so much as a headache from one of these GM products, and you have been consuming them your whole life. And if they're so bad for us, why does our life expectancy continue to increase? Okay, some things to think about. I'm going to stop there, and next time, probably short video. Well, they're never short. We're going to talk about major forms of GMOs, concerns, substantial equivalence, that sort of thing. Have a good day.